Hello everyone and welcome to lecture 19 of section 4, where I'll be showing you a few materials, the ones I think which are used most commonly. So the first one we will talk about is a typical plastic shader. And plastic can be actually very complex because it has surface properties which allow light to enter the object. So we will be showing you a basic plastic shader and a bit more advanced one which is using subsurface scattering. So as you can see in my Maya scene on the left, we have a little car and we have a platform where the car is supported on. And I have created two shaders, which are by default the standard surface shaders for the support and for the driver. So if I start the render by hitting the play button, you can see my buckets are starting to work. And if I isolate shift click and I do a selection of the head only, and I change the color of my base shader, you can see that it's affecting it. So let's start off with a red plastic car, a basic plastic shader. So the first thing you want to do is choose a nice color. Most of the time it's more saturated colors for play toys or something like that. So let's just choose something interesting. A bit more saturation to this. Maybe a bit darker plastic. Let's just disable the bucket view, and then let's just shift click and we can see the whole car being rendered. Currently I have a specular roughness of 0.550, and it's definitely way too rough for this kind of plastic. So what you want to do is just maybe reduce the roughness to 0.1, and you can see all of a sudden it gets a nice shiny color. This might be a bit too much, so we can roughen it up a bit. Maybe 1.5, just to get a bit broader specular on this. And what else you can do is play around with the IOR, which is the index of refraction, which is kind of controlling how shiny the object is. So if I put in a high value, you can see it gets really shiny. And if I put a value around 1, it's only really on the 90-degree angle reflection. So the more I bring it in, you can see the more you get something reflecting on the edges. A typical plastic has a value of, I think, 1.55. So this would be a regular plastic as a measured value. So if this is too much, you can definitely just reduce this amount. But I would not go lower than 1.5, and I would not go higher than maybe 1.6. And this would kind of be already a typical plastic shader. So let's jump over to the support structure and maybe make this like a nice blue color. So let's choose the same color spectrum and then just change the hue to something more interesting, to something more blue. I think this is pretty cool. So also play around with the roughness, maybe 0.15, so it gets a bit more shiny. And then you can also play around with the IOR, but we just leave it on the 1.52. So right off the get-go, this would be a pretty good plastic shader, nothing too special though. It's just one base color and a specular lobe on top. So what you can do now is you can create a bit more interesting plastic shaders. Let's just concentrate on the driver. So I'm isolating just the head to have a bit faster feedback on this. And the first thing what we can do is let's play around with the subsurface. So let's open up the tab and let's just introduce a weight of 1. So this means this object is now fully subsurface scattering. Change the mode to random walk, which is a bit more accurate. And let's change the subsurface color to the same red we had before. Something like this. And you can now see by having a radius of a white color, you can see that there is some color bleeding going on around the edges. And you can overall see that the car feels a bit more organic. It's not as thick. It has some organic feel to it, something like it's absorbing light. So obviously we can play around with the color. Instead of having a white radius, let's choose kind of the same red tone, but then make it a higher value. Let's go with a value of 1 and maybe just desaturate it a tiny bit. I think so. So let's head over and render the head again. Now you can see we get a really nice edge on the helmet where it's really thin. You can also play around with the scale. So if you think this is too much for your object, it's depending on size definitely, you can play this down. So this would be just 10% of that. And you can see it almost feels like a shader without scattering. It's a bit more solid, but it's definitely more realistic than just a typical plastic shader, because plastic does absorb some light, maybe not to the extent as this, but you can definitely play around. And always a good idea is to have a proper reference. So go to Google, go on YouTube or whatever, and search for reference images, or just shoot your own image is also an option for sure. So this would be setting up a basic plastic. Nothing too high end. For beginners, this is just fine. This should work for most of the scenes. And another thing which we can do is make it a bit more interesting by actually playing around with the specular some more. And we will try to introduce the coat as well, which is another sheen layer. So occasionally what you see is you get clear coated clear coated plastic, which is at first very rough. So it has a rough plastic feel to it, but it's covered by a gloss layer. So let's just do that by introducing some roughness. Let's go maybe to a value of 0.5. And now you can see it gets really soft and it feels really like almost foam or something really rubbery. We can also go a bit higher, maybe. Let's go up to 5.5 to get a bit more roughness onto the helmet. And now what we can do is just introduce a coat. So if I enable this with 1, you can now see we get a really clear coat on top. And it feels like now a covered, like a coated plastic. And occasionally you see that. And because it's adding up, it feels like it's getting a bit too bright. So what you can do is actually play down the weight of the specular, or just maybe just go 0.5 on the base specular, and you can now see it looks a bit better. It's not as bright overall. It's still very shiny, but this is something you can do as well. This would be a bit more advanced plastic shader, and now comes a few more interesting things. So we will add some roughness to this. And also we will add a bump to the coat. So I just create a bump shader, AI bump to D, and I will also create a AI bump, an AI noise shader, like these two guys. And I will connect the red channel to the bump map, and then I will connect the out value to my coat normal. Be sure it's a coat normal and not the normal camera. To make sure, you can just drag it actually into the shading slot and choose out value, and make sure it's if we find it coat normal like this. And on default you will not see much because most of the time the scale is too low. So by hitting isolate selected in the Maya render view, you can actually preview the texture. And in this case, the scale is fine, so it must be something with the bump height in the bump node. So let's just disable isolate selected again and increase the bump height in the bump 2D node. So let's go maybe over value of 0.1. And now you can see we get some breakup on the code pass, and this is definitely way too much. And the idea is to get some really soft surface modulation, some breakup, just to make it more interesting as a code layer. And for this, I think the noise pattern is too tight. So let's just reduce the scale by maybe 0.2 in all X, Y, and Z. And if I hit isolate selected again, you can see now it's a lot broader. It's not as tight as it was before. And by rendering this, you can see there is definitely some breakup. It's not perfect lines anymore. This is definitely something we want to work with. And another thing is we will create another bump for the specular, or for the regular normal map. Normal camera. So let's just create another AI noise and another bump and do the same connection. The red channel goes to bump map, and this time the out value goes to the normal camera instead. And by doing that, we actually apply two bump nodes. One goes to the middle layer, which is the specular, and the other one goes to the coat layer. And what this enables us is to have a shader which has actually some roughness to it on the base level, and then on the coat a bigger roughness as well. So just to visualize it, I'm just disabling the coat for a minute. And from the get-go, you won't see much because we have the same problem as before. The bump is is not intense enough. So let's just boost it up by maybe 0.25. And now you can see we get some really soft bumps everywhere. So I still want to boost this up a bit more, but instead of changing the height, I want to go into the noise and play around with the noise shader a bit. So I want to have more details. So let's just hit the octaves, maybe 3 layers on this, and let's just distort this by maybe 0.25 as well. This should give us a bit more detail in the pattern itself. I still feel it's not enough, so let's just change the scale to 5. So this is now a really soft noise pattern, and if I go back to the shaded mode, you can see, or it almost registers as noise, so this might be a bit going too far. Let's just change the height to 0.1 maybe. Yeah, and okay, this I might have gone too much of the scale, so maybe try 3 instead. Okay, and we can also play up the spec or reduce, make it a bit more shiny, maybe 0.4 in the spec. And if I zoom in here, you can see now it has definitely some roughness to this. Let's just make this a bit less noisy, maybe by rendering 0.6 and the AA samples. And now you can see actually what I'm trying to achieve. You can see there's like a really soft bump to the whole car. Really interesting effect. And then if we bring back the coat on top, maybe let's just boost the bump a bit more. Maybe let's go to 0.2. Okay, this is a bit stronger now. And let's reduce the distortion a bit. Definitely better, 0.1. Okay, and we can also just a touch more reducing the roughness, so it gets a bit more shiny, and you can now see it's really nice and bumpy. So if I play back the code back to 1, what you should see now is you have actually a coat on top of this nice and bumpy surface. And this is a very interesting effect, and this would be a very like it feels like a polished plastic with some surface to it. I still think that the coat is too much, so let's just reduce the IOR by maybe 1.3 so it's not as shiny. And yeah, I think this could actually work. So let's just render the full image and see what we get. I really like what we have now. We have a nice bumpy surface and a really clean coat on top of this. So one last thing which really makes your shaders stand out is to add roughness to your coat or to your specular passes. Typically on toys which have hard edges, because they get played with, they have some wear and tear on the edges. So what we want to do now is actually use a roughness which has plugged in a curvature shader. So let's just create a AI curvature shader, and just for the fun of it, just connect it quickly to the ID slot. And if I hit isolate selected, we can just see what this shader actually does. And if you check the previous lectures on curvature, you should know the parameters. So I will be just increasing the radius by maybe by 0.4, and you can see now we have a nice edge to this. Let's just go up a bit more, maybe 5.5. Increase the samples to 5, and this should give us a pretty good looking curvature shader. What value is this now? So if I check at the bottom here of my renderer, you can see I actually get the RGB colors back. So we have a value of 0.1, which is not enough. I want to have it a value of 0.4. So let's just use a multiplier and multiply it by 4. So now let's see what we get now. We have values ranging up to 5, 4, 5. So this is pretty interesting, and this is something I want to work with. you can see now we get some structure here, which is actually, which might be helpful. We can play around with the spread though if we don't want to see that. Reduce the spread a bit and it gets rid of this stuff. But for now, I'll just keep it on and we'll just see what we get. So what I want to do now is actually connect the curvature to the code roughness. So by disabling selection, this is our typical shader. And what I would expect to see now is some roughness on the edges here. So let's just hook up the red channel to my code roughness. And you can see that the edge gets blurred. It's not as shiny as it was before. Let's see on other edges which were strong, like the car here. This should be softer, and the rims definitely. And you can see the edges are not that shiny anymore, which is very interesting. And another cool thing which I like to do is use the curvature as well, because it got hit often and dented or whatever. What you can do is make the edges maybe a bit more, like change the color for them. So what I like to do as well is use the same curvature with a color correct node and plug in the, oh, that's the wrong node. I meant AI color correct node. And plug in the red channel as well to the mask. So this is a black and white input. So whatever is white will get color corrected. And I want to change the subsurface color, which is currently red. So what I'm doing, I'm just sampling this color here. And then I'm using the oops, what did I do now? I changed the oval color, which I did not want to do. Let's just choose this color back. So we have the red. And head over to the AI color correct, go to the input and choose the same red color and connect the out color to the surface color. We should not see any difference in the render because it's essentially just the same color. But what I want to do now is let's just reduce the saturation now in the color correct node to maybe half, and you should see that the edge gets really worn out. And it gets really white, and you can actually see this a lot better on the rims, how bright they get. And this is a very interesting effect. It's kind of like a bleaching out or used material. I think 0.5 is too much, so maybe let's go 7.5 and see what this looks now. And you can also introduce some hue shift, maybe to make it a bit more yellow. So let's just check isolate selected and see actually what our input texture looks like. And we can see this is what we get. So if I head over to hue shift, oh, this is definitely too much, but it's going in the yellow direction. So let's maybe just choose a value of 0.05. And this is a bit more orange, which we can totally work with. So now we have a colored edge. It might be too strong, which does not help. Yeah, it's too strong. So let's just go maybe 0.1 and saturation of 0.85. And this should be subtle enough to register a color shift on the edges. So let's just render for the final image and then we see what we get. Alright, so now we have the finished render and I think it looks pretty good. You can see that the blue shader is very basic compared to the more polished red car. It's definitely an interesting shader, a coated plastic with some surface irregularities, and it just looks interesting with the edge bleeding and the edge roughness. And just compare this again to the blue, which is just the basic plastic shader. So feel free to test it on your own objects, test your shaders, send me some renders if you want to get some feedback on them. So this sums up a typical plastic shader approach. We've first started to do a basic one, which just uses a base color and a speck. And then we introduced some subsurface scattering, and we got more advanced each time. So we added a code, we added roughness, and we definitely got something really nice looking. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture about plastic, and I'm eager to see you in the next lecture. Thank you.